I want to be mindful of time, so I want to keep my talk as short as possible. Professor Yadav has covered a huge ground, not much for us to add. So thank you for setting the stage. So I'll really truly try and keep my talk as short as possible. I'm going to focus on clean hydrogen, something that Professor Yadav referred to many times during his talk, and tell you a little bit about how the story of hydrogen might build in India particularly, although there is a huge amount of interest across the world. Just to add to what Professor Yadav said very quickly, we are a country growing with the aspiration of growing to about $5 to $8 trillion economy by 2030, at the end of this decade, much larger, 10x larger by the time we complete 100 years of freedom, which simply means that the energy demand is going to double and it's likely to reach something like 75 exajoules by 2050. But as of today, we import a large amount of carbon in the form of fossil energy and burn all of that to produce the energy needs of the country today. And as a result, we emit about 3 gigatons, 3 billion tons of CO2, as Professor Yadav also mentioned. So it's clearly, as India aspires to move into the orbit of developed nations, we must do this by fueling our economic growth, both with clean energy as well as reduce the import demands on energy. So try and achieve energy security from end to end, that is right from sources all the way to systems engineering that again Professor Yadav referred to. There are many options that the country has, starting with improving energy efficiency, and I think India has done marvelous in this area. The LED revolution, as we all know, has really improved the energy efficiency at the bottom of the pyramid. We are increasing renewable energy inputs into our grid. However, all of renewable energy requires storage because this is not available 24/7, none of the renewable energy sources. And therefore, along with renewable energy, there is a huge impetus on growing energy storage options. The country is looking more for pumped hydro right now. There are many interesting startups coming on gravity energy storage. Batteries is of course going to come provided we achieve the right costs for the batteries. And hydrogen also is an energy carrier and one of the highest gravimetric energy densities, and so it's essentially an energy storage option. However, coal is not going to go away. Base thermal load will come with coal. We have enormous reserves of coal, although they are high ash coal. But technologies will have to be developed not to burn the coal but to gasify the coal and convert the syngas into chemicals and materials, while at the same time through an integrated cycle also use that energy to generate steam and so on. However, whatever option we use, it seems imperative for India to increase nuclear energy production. I'll tell you some numbers there. But all in all of these energy options have to be innovated and made in India if we really want to achieve clean energy and end-to-end energy security. Towards this goal, the Prime Minister announced Panchamrut in the COP26 in Paris, and the 5 items there, I'm not going to read them. The most important one is the one at the bottom, is to achieve the net zero emissions by 2070. A very difficult target to reach for those of you who are involved in it. But as of the end of this decade, we are looking at increasing the non-fossil installed energy capacity to 500 gigawatts, and much of this is going to come from solar. What does this transition mean is given in the pie chart there. As of today, we have 85+% of fossil energy being used today, and as we move to 2050, the size of that pie chart is going to grow from 34 exajoules to 75 exajoules, but also the distribution is going to increase, and that's the aspiration to reach 50% non-fossil energy. That number is something that we should be mindful of, because that means about 24,000 terawatt hours of energy. 500 gigawatts is hardly 25% of that, right? And so it's very clear that 500 is not going to be enough. We have to probably double it, and no matter what we do with that, we still need to have the rest of it coming from nuclear energy. So that's the reason I said nuclear is going to be an important factor in India's clean energy ambitions. What I do want to say is the table at the bottom, and that says that the important sectors that contribute to emissions today are the ones listed there. And if that emission has to be abated, some of those sectors are more amenable to green electrons, that is renewable energy, and some of them are more amenable to molecules. And the last two are where we think hydrogen might play an important role. Hydrogen is widely used as a feedstock. Prof. Yadav also mentioned about it. So we need molecules to transform other molecules. For example, the best of the diesel we produce today is made by hydrodesulfurization, that requires hydrogen. Ammonia that we make today requires hydrogen, and so on and so forth. Multiple chemicals that we use today require hydrogen, they require molecules. Some of those processes can be converted into electrochemical processes that require just renewable electricity, but much of them still require molecule, and that's where hydrogen, that's the low-hanging fruit for going to hydrogen. So if you want to decarbonize chemical industry, move to hydrogen sources that reduce CO2 emissions. Heavy transportation, the jury is not out yet whether it will go to clean hydrogen fueled trucks and buses and trains and so on, or it will go to other sources of biofuels, or it will go to electrical mobility. The jury is not out yet, but I think there is still a lot of interest in trying to use hydrogen for heavy duty transportation. Hydrogen is interesting, Professor Yadav also mentioned, because it's what is called a sector coupling agent. That is, it takes electricity from renewable sources, any of the renewable sources or fossil sources, and converts that into molecules. So electricity going into hydrogen, the process through, and there are multiple processes, one of them is electrolysis. So you convert electricity into hydrogen. That hydrogen then can be used in a variety of industries that is given at the right side. And if needed, it's not really a great option, but if needed, and some of those applications are unique and niche applications, but you can convert hydrogen back into electricity by things like fuel cells. What is interesting here is that the conversion efficiencies from electricity to hydrogen and hydrogen back to electricity are not bad. Even today, the worst electrolyzer that you can buy has at least 75% efficiency. And the worst fuel cell that you can buy has at least 45% efficiency. And I want you to compare these numbers with the standard conventional numbers. For example, the best diesel engine today would give you about 40% in the lab, 42% in the lab. In India on roads, it's far less than that. So these conversion efficiencies are very interesting, and therefore this is a very nice sector coupling agent that converts back and forth electrons into molecules. I'm going to skip this because Professor Yadav did talk about it. There are many colors of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a colorless gas, but one adds color codes to it. The color codes are only implications of the CO2 emissions associated with that form of hydrogen. In India, we today produce 6 million tons of hydrogen. All of that comes from grey hydrogen. Most of it comes from methane reforming. Some of it comes from methanol reforming. And this reforming process produces anywhere between 7 to 10 tons of CO2 per ton of hydrogen that you produce. Professor Yadav mentioned about blue hydrogen, which is basically taking the grey hydrogen and doing something useful with the CO2. Either you convert it into a valuable chemical or a fuel, or you store it, sequester it somewhere deep down in alkaline aquifers, in a seabed or in basalt strata, and so on. And that's called blue hydrogen. Basically, you are fixing carbon from that emission. In India, however, we do not have as of today any major facility to store and sequester CO2, and therefore as of now blue hydrogen is really and truly not an option for India. And that's the reason the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has moved directly to green hydrogen. The ministry always talks about how India jumped from Bharat 4 to Bharat 6. There was no Bharat 5. And that's similarly here, we are trying to jump from grey hydrogen to green hydrogen. There is no blue hydrogen as of today in between. Green hydrogen is one that is formed by either splitting water or using biomass. The definition that India has adopted for green hydrogen today is emission factors of 2 tons per CO2 emitted per ton of hydrogen produced. And this is what is called the well-to-gate approach, which involves scope 1 emissions and scope 2 emissions. So that's the definition of green hydrogen. This definition changes from country to country. But that's the one that India has adopted. So if you use, for example, purely solar or solar plus wind energy to produce hydrogen, the emissions are less than 0.5 tons of CO2 per ton of hydrogen. So these are the various forms of hydrogen, and as I said, India has created the National Green Hydrogen Mission. This is a $2.2 billion mission for producing green hydrogen and utilizing green hydrogen. I'm not going to go through that shopping list of everything that is included in the National Green Hydrogen Mission. What I do want to say is that there is enough incentive for running a lot of pilots, and I think that's important for a country as large as India with various climatic factors and road conditions and so on. It's imperative that new technologies are tested on the ground, and therefore there is a separate budget allocation for running various pilot projects in India. I think that's one of the more important things in this mission document. There's a PLI scheme, which is the largest budget, and the PLI scheme's just been completed. Tenders have been announced. Just today in the news you would have read some of the first tenders have been awarded to bidders who have successfully bidded for producing hydrogen as well as for manufacturing electrolyzers. What is equally important is the enabling factors. So it's not just about producing green hydrogen, it's how do you enable the production of green hydrogen in terms of incentives. So for instance, waiver of interstate transmission charges, there are many incentives given both at a central level as well as the state level. And all of these incentives are very critical in the initial stages to support the cost of production of hydrogen, because the scale is not there yet. And as the scale picks up, hopefully the incentives can be taken out. Now, a lot of people ask why hydrogen now, because hydrogen has gone through at least 7 cycles, cycles of hype and then interest dying out. And so the question is, why is hydrogen interesting today? Is it going to be another hype or is it going to be reality? And I think there are 2 or 3 factors that are important here. The first one is that decarbonization today is not something you simply talk about, it's something that the market demands. The investors are demanding decarbonization, the global markets is demanding decarbonization, and that's, as Professor Yadav said, the emissions are so high, the carbon concentrations of CO2 in the average concentration is increasing so rapidly that things are not looking very good, and therefore decarbonization is clearly the most important driving factor. The second is the fact that the solar costs have plummeted, right? And the silicon chip costs are much smaller now. Renewable costs are much lower today. India itself at a utility park is looking at less than 2 rupees per kilowatt hour. And so the solar costs have dropped, cost of renewable energy has dropped, and that's a critical factor for making hydrogen. The third is that the supply chains are now more or less in place that has reduced the cost of capex of electrolyzers. And so the left chart shows how the capex for electrolyzers has substantially reduced. And those of you who are tracking this have seen the latest bids in China. Alkaline electrolyzer capex is today only $200 per kilowatt. What used to be $800,000, $900,000 per kilowatt has gone down by a factor of 5. And so the OPEX has come down because the renewable energy has come down, the capex has come down because the electrolyzer costs have come down, and therefore hydrogen today makes more sense, and therefore we believe that it is the right time for hydrogen, and this is not likely to be just a hype. And that's the reason why across the world, in almost every country, every continent, there are huge projects of hydrogen that have been announced. Almost $300 billion of investments has been announced, and in India itself there are many large investments. About 38 large investments have been announced already. More are coming because the PLI scheme is just now been announced. And so what does the opportunity for hydrogen look like in India? In the near term, as I said, we are producing 5 to 6 million tons of hydrogen. All of that is grey, and that's the lowest hanging fruit because much of that is used to in refineries and fertilizers and steel industry and so on. So the one in refinery and fertilizer is probably the low hanging fruit. Mid-term, the demand is likely to double to about 10 to 12 million tons per annum. And within that time span, we hope that the infrastructure for storing hydrogen, for transporting hydrogen, refueling hydrogen will come up, especially across the freight corridors in India. And therefore, the heavy duty transportation, at least a fraction of it, will hopefully convert into hydrogen based transportation. This is still, as I said earlier, the jury is not out yet on this. Long term, however, very large and hard to abate sectors like steel and cement, they will have to decarbonize. Some of the biggest experiments on using hydrogen in blast furnaces have happened in this country and successfully demonstrated. But this is not easy, moving from blast furnace, moving from coal, coking coal to hydrogen in mammoth blast furnaces is really not an easy option. There are other reasons which I will not talk about where it's not so much the production of hydrogen is not a problem. There are other things in the infrastructure, for instance, is a problem for why blast furnaces is not easy to move. But it will have to be done, and therefore that is a long-term option of moving from grey to green hydrogen for these very difficult, hard to abate sectors. There are some other very interesting options for India to use green hydrogen. India has announced the national logistic policies. This is a wonderful AI-based platform, a hub and spoke model, where from port to last mile delivery, the freight is going to move around the large freight transportation corridors that are being constructed today. For example, Mumbai-Nagpur, the Samruddhi Mahamarg is one of those. Okay, and so there are these large infrastructure that has been built, and a high-tech AI-driven mobility transportation policy has just been announced. Now, if you couple that with hydrogen, it looks very interesting because you can take very large trucks, smaller numbers but larger trucks moving over longer distances, and that is exactly the use case where hydrogen beats everything else. So if you marry the national logistics policies with the green hydrogen mission, I think that's quite a winner. You can do the math and check this for yourself, and we've done it. The other interesting thing is India has about 100 islands around it, and some of them are very strategically placed. For example, the Great Nicobar Island is something that India is developing as a strategic location. It's right at the shipping lane, one of the most populous shipping lane. And today that kind of islands are supported by diesel, right? The electricity energy there is supported by diesel, which is transported from the mainland. Imagine if you were to create renewable energy parks there, create hydrogen, bunker hydrogen, and use it for ship transportation. It's something that will compete against Singapore, which is just across the strait. So there are these interesting options available for India, and I hope we look at it more carefully. Lot of states have kick-started the hydrogen growth. Kerala is the leader, but almost every other state, including Maharashtra, has announced green hydrogen policies. There are many smaller but pilots, successful pilots that have already been demonstrated in the country. So I think the excitement is really growing here, and not just the public sector, but the private sector is also investing very deeply. We are going to look forward to Siddharth talk about how his company is investing into hydrogen, but a huge amount of interest from the corporate sector is also being shown in this domain. I want to end by this last slide just to give you a feel for what it means to even convert the first 5 million tons of hydrogen. Just to get to a sense of reality here. To make 5 million tons of hydrogen by electrolysis, and that may not be the best route to make it, but suppose you want to make everything by electrolysis, you would need 32 gigawatts of renewable energy. You would need 300 million liters per day of RO water. Now that 32 is an interesting number. It's about 25%. No, what is that? 20% of the renewable aims that we have for the country. So it's not very large. The 300 million liters of water per day looks like a very large number, but actually it is not. the entire Chennai city is supported today by 3 large RO plants. One of them, which is the largest in India, is already producing 100 million liters per day of RO water, right? So it's not a very large number. I did talk about large renewable electricity required, about 120 gigawatts required to support the 32 gigawatts of electrolyzer. But along with it, huge amount of storage is required, because all of that sun, wind are not available 24/7. So it's not just sun and wind, it's a huge storage requirement for it. And that's a very large capex, about $150 billion of capex would be required to set up something like that. A lot of land is required, but that's not very large. It's 0.1% of India's land mass. But if all of this is done, we are looking at, just by producing this 5 million tons of hydrogen, we are looking at abatement of 30 to 40 million tons of CO2. That's not a small number. And it also means saving foreign exchange to about 60,000 crores. And that's the reason hydrogen seems very interesting. The numbers look daunting, but actually they're not as daunting as they might sound. The real elephant in the room is the levelized cost of hydrogen, and Professor Yadav mentioned about anything less than $3 per kg starts making hydrogen very interesting. How do you get there, right? So today, if you have power available to your doorstep at 4 rupees a unit, if you design your electrolyzer plant carefully, by sizing it carefully so that you have an integrated utility park and electrolyzer together, it is possible to reach $3 per kg even today, okay, but under those conditions. And now you add scale of manufacturing, you add indigenization, you can cut another $0.8 per kg, you add technology upgrades, move the efficiency by another 2-3% up, your capex starts to go down. And so it's possible to shave off another $0.50 or $1 from that $3 and hydrogen then starts looking extremely attractive. But there are lots of ifs and buts in this, and the country has to take a risk of or a bet on scaling up electrolyzers, scaling up biomass-based hydrogen in order to hit that less than $3 per kg of hydrogen at the user level. For sugar industry, you can have multiple routes from sugarcane, let's say, producing electricity, selling electricity, which is what is done today. Instead of that, if you convert that electricity into hydrogen, you can today get a lot of margin, because the merchant sale price of hydrogen today is anywhere between 400 to 800 rupees a kg of hydrogen. So there's a lot of margin available. So instead of selling electricity, selling hydrogen might look very interesting. But what Professor Yadav mentioned was the turquoise hydrogen. That is even more interesting, because you can take biomass, pyrolyze it to make graphene, and if you can make the right quality carbon, not just graphene, any right quality carbon, there are many interesting applications. In fact, the lowest application for that carbon is in the tire industry, and that itself fetches you a lot of price for that carbon. Hydrogen itself has a good price as well. So these are all interesting options that are available today. So I'm going to stop here. There are many slides, but I'm going to skip all of them because I'm too mindful of time. And I think all I want to say here is that hydrogen is coming up to be an exciting option for the sugar industry. There is many things that are possible in the domain of hydrogen, and I hope that as the country moves into more renewable energy and less carbon emitting forms of energy, hydrogen will play a critical role as one of the clean energy transition vectors. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lele. It was very interesting.